We have with us the Commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Service, Kevin McAleenan, who has generously agreed to give us a little bit of time this morning for a conversation. Really looking forward to this discussion, Mr. Commissioner.
Good to be here.
This is something we've been looking forward to for a long time. For those who may not know us, my name is Eric Farnsworth. I head the Washington office of the Council of the Americas. The Council of the Americas is a business and policy organization, and we promote democracy, open markets, and the rule of law throughout the Western Hemisphere. With Central American migration issues in the news on a daily basis and our deep and abiding interest in the peaceful development of the region, we're delighted to have this opportunity today, as I mentioned. And I also want to welcome all of you on television and webcast. We're delighted that you're tuning in. We have a great audience, we understand, from outside of Washington and elsewhere. And we also want to welcome all of you in this room and encourage you to tweet your impressions about this conversation. The hashtag we're using is CA Migration, and our handle, to the extent that you care to use that, is @ASCOA. There may be no more sensitive political issues in the current environment than migration. Mr. Commissioner, you know that very, very well. Everyone here is very familiar with the reports and recent activities on the border with Mexico and the caravans of Central American migrants who have been traveling from the region to the United States or toward the United States. As migration flows from Mexico itself have steadily declined, migration from the Northern Triangle countries, which are Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, has picked up. So we're here this morning to try to figure out what's causing Central Americans, many of them women and children and families, to attempt the dangerous 2,000-mile journey north to seek an uncertain future. What can be done within the region to decrease the urge to migrate? What policies and strategic repositioning might be considered? Washington has long recognized, as you all know, on a bipartisan basis, the need to address the root causes of migration from the Northern Triangle countries. In coordination with Mexico, the Alliance for Prosperity and Security was intended to do just that, and leaders from the U.S., Mexico, and the Northern Triangle countries have come together over the past 2 years in Miami and Washington to build on these efforts. And so now, with a new government in place in Mexico, which views joint efforts in Central America as a priority, it's timely to reevaluate the approach, perhaps, incorporating best practices from recent experience and focusing more clearly on reforms that promote job creation and workforce development, security, and anti-corruption. So as I mentioned, to explore these complex issues, we're so pleased to be joined this morning by Kevin McAleenan, who's the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, after which a panel of experts will explore these issues in greater depth. And we'll be able to take some of your questions too. We'll have note cards that we'll be passing around and ask you to put your questions on those, and then we'll collect them and pass them forward. Commissioner McAleenan is responsible for leading the country's largest law enforcement agency. I didn't know that, actually, before we set this up. And he's also the second largest revenue collecting source for the federal government. I suppose the first is the IRS.
That would be that.
Okay, very good. He oversees some 60,000 employees. He manages a budget of over $13 billion. And his department and agency facilitates some $4 trillion in trade and the travel of over 365 million people through U.S. ports of entry. This is a real mandate. This is a real portfolio. This is the real deal. So, but it's important to recognize the reach of U.S. CBP. Having visited Central America's Northern Triangle in September, his perspectives on these issues are also guided by personal knowledge and real-time understanding. We're going to explore that in just a minute. So ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome him here to begin our program. And would you please join me in welcoming to the Council of the Americas the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Commissioner Kevin McAleenan. Mr. Commissioner, there's a lot going on migration issues, as we've just noted, a lot of issues going on in terms of the border. To help get us started, help us frame these issues. How should we be viewing what's really a complex and complicated issue, but from your perch, how are you viewing this, and help us frame this conversation?
Sure. No, thank you so much for the invitation, the opportunity to be here with you today, Eric, and we have a very distinguished panel following, so I'd love to hear their thoughts as well. There are a few issues that are more important to us operationally, although I appreciate you articulating the full scope of CBP. We have a lot to do with trade and travel, with counterterrorism, but obviously fundamentally border security and addressing migration flows. So what we're seeing today, I've called in multiple for both a border security and a humanitarian crisis. And people have asked, what's different? Why are you saying that? The numbers are not as high as they were, say, in the early 2000s. Well, we released our data yesterday. We released our border encounters, both our apprehensions for people crossing illegally between ports of entry, as well as those who do present at our ports of entry, many of whom are lawfully claiming asylum but arriving without documents. And for the second month in a row, we've had over 60,000 total, about 85% of them coming unlawfully between ports of entry, the other 15% presenting at a port of entry. And that's a significant increase, and it's been going up month over month since about March of 2017, when we did have a historic drop after the inauguration of President Trump. So within that flow, though, there's a significant demographic change that I don't know it has been widely recognized. Really, through 2012, 2013 timeframe, we still saw about 90+% of our crossings were single adults, primarily male. Additionally, they were primarily arriving from our large neighbor, Mexico, with a population of 120 million. That's completely changed. In November, 59% of the arrivals were families or children. So from over 90% single adults to 59% in November, families and children. We're now in our 5th out of 6 years with more of the arrivals being from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America than from Mexico, and that gap continues to widen. So that's a fundamental shift in what we're seeing. And the reason I call it both a border security and a humanitarian crisis is, given that changed demographic, we still do face significant numbers of single adults, criminals, smugglers, increased hard narcotics coming between ports of entry. At the same time, we're trying to adjust and respond to a flow of economic migrants coming between ports of entry, many people with legitimate asylum claims, families and children that are really pressuring the system. Just think about that Border Patrol agent patrolling a certain segment of the border who encounters a group of 30 to 50 family members coming across. He's got to call in for backup, got to respond, got to take care of them, make sure they get across the river safely. And at the same time, we know that there are criminals and smugglers bringing drugs across in that same sector, using that family group as a diversion. They've charged them $5,000 to $7,000 per person to make the journey from Central America to our border, $500 just to get across the river. That last step is a huge profit center for violent criminal groups right on the border. So this is not a victimless crime to cross the border illegally. It puts people at risk, it puts our agents at risk, it enables smugglers to bring narcotics and other substances across, and it's a huge profit center for the most violent criminal organizations of the world. So we've got these really vulnerable populations in the hands of violent criminals, and they're coming on a promise that they'll be allowed to stay in the U.S., when really only 10 to 20% have valid claims of protection and asylum once their immigration proceeding is completed. So there's a huge mismatch in this dynamic, in the legal framework, in what we're doing in terms of alignment of policy with Mexico, and the push factors in Central America, and the aid that we need to talk about today. But I think there are solutions. I think there are opportunities partnering with the Central American government as well as the incoming administration in Mexico to address all of this. But it's a different challenge than we face historically, and it's both a border security and humanitarian crisis.
I'm struck by your statistic that you put out there. 59%, almost 2/3 of the migrants are women and children, families. From Central America, what explains that shift? Do you have a sense of, you were just in Central America, right. You saw it on the ground with your own eyes and your team.
Sure.
Give us a sense of why is that occurring?
Yeah, there are a number of dynamics in terms of why we see push factors from Central America driving this migration. I do have to start briefly with the pull factors, though. And the reason that the population has changed so much from single adults to families and children is the awareness and recognition actually being advertised by smugglers who start this at a retail level, almost like a travel agency in communities in Central America, saying if you bring a child with you, you will be released if you cross the border illegally, and you'll be allowed to stay in the United States. And so the phenomenon that we're seeing is a direct response to our gaps in our legal framework that don't allow for the completion of an immigration proceeding and repatriation of those who don't have valid asylum or protection claims. So that first and foremost, our system and our pull factors, our broken system, are inviting and incentivizing these groups to come. So
if I can break in, is that a congressional issue or is it a regulatory issue?
It's statutory. It's statutory. There are three elements. We're unable to keep a family together in custody through an immigration proceeding. They have to be released within 20 days. There's a huge gap in the asylum process from the initial assessment of if someone has a fear of return to their home country. About 85% of those who claim fear are passing that initial assessment. But at the end of the process with an immigration judge, we're really only seeing 10 to 20% actually having a valid asylum claim. So there's a 3 to 5 year period where you're in the U.S. Many don't even actually file an asylum claim, what they're supposed to within a year of arrival. So there's a huge mismatch. And then, of course, for children, for a child from Mexico who comes across illegally, they're returned to Mexico through the Health and Human Services Department. But for countries further away under the statute, they're not allowed to be repatriated that way. So those are the statutory issues that kind of create the pull factors. On the push factors, what's happening in Central America that's different? A lot of people think first and foremost about violence. They think murder rates, they think about the gang violence, and obviously there are significant concerns there with MS-13, with 18th Street and other transnational, very violent criminal organizations. But what we looked at over the last several years is really a changing demographic coming from Central America, not arriving from the big cities, but primarily now we're seeing from Guatemala and Honduras, folks from rural areas. The UN World Food Program, the International Organization of Migration, have all written very astute studies about drought, about the coffee price decline, and how that's affecting the ability of families to provide for themselves. It's the highest rate of malnutrition in the Western Hemisphere is in Guatemala of 50%, and it's even higher than that in the Western Highlands. And we're seeing that directly translate into who's arriving at our border. About 30% of the arrivals last year were from Guatemala, and the vast majority of those arrivals were from the Western Highlands. We're also seeing the rural areas of Honduras come into play here on the border with Guatemala, where they also are in that dry corridor that's faced drought and having challenges with food insecurity. So really the hunger concern has become a real prevalent push factor from our analysis and perspective and in engaging with international bodies and with our partner governments. Economic opportunity is really either one or two in terms of the push factor. Guatemala, for instance, the average age is 19. The number of jobs that are created each year, about 35 to 40,000, when you have about 150,000 people, young people entering the workforce. That's a huge mismatch. So to look for opportunity, there are jobs in Mexico, there are jobs in the United States. So you can see why people would want to move toward that economic opportunity. So those are really the two factors that we see most prevalent. The violence, though, remains an important issue. I'm really impressed with the progress. The plan, El Salvador Seguro, for instance, in El Salvador, they've reduced their murder rate by 43% in 5 years. In Honduras, it's down 50% in the last 2 years. And in Guatemala, which never has seen the very high murder rates that its neighbors have seen, it's down 33% since 2013. Those are all very good signs in terms of the violence. That does not mean that certain communities and neighborhoods are not impacted dramatically and that that's a factor for some people leaving Central America. But we see it as an economic opportunity and poverty issue, food insecurity issue, and then of course continued issues with violence and security. So we need to attack all three push factors.
I mean, what you're describing is an unbelievably complicated menu of things that are serving as push factors, and they may be similar for people in the same geographic region or community, but from country to country or rural to urban, the issues may be quite different. So that begs the question then, in terms of the United States, Mexico working together with Central American countries, what can we do about it? I began my career at the State Department working Central American issues almost 30 years ago. And it was a different time, it was a different place, there were military conflicts, etc. But when the peace accords were signed in Guatemala in 1996, there was a huge sigh of relief and sense of hopefulness that now the region has a chance to move forward. The United States, in my view, appropriately pushed forward the Central America Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, the Dominican Republic, to give an opportunity for job growth and job creation and trade expansion. But if you look at where Central America, particularly the Northern Triangle countries, are today, it almost seems that the progress has not been nearly as much as what we certainly hoped for, but even could have expected. How should we be addressing these issues? It's probably not a fair question. You're a law enforcement guy, right?
Sure.
I'm not, but having said that, deeply involved and have a sense of what's worked in the past and what we need to do going forward. Do we need to redirect our assistance programs? Do we need to find different partners? Do we need to do more of the same? Help us think this through, because this is a very important question, particularly right now in Washington as people are looking at budgets and forward appropriations and things like that.
No question, and true, we don't run aid programs directly, but CBP is a very strong participant with our partner agencies in these governments, and given the breadth of what we do have an impact on the law enforcement and security side, certainly, but also in terms of the customs side and trade promotion. And of course, in the policy making process here in DC, I want to make sure that my advice to Secretary Nielsen, as we're engaging on Congress, is really targeting the actual push factors that we're facing so that we can apply our foreign aid and our assistance in the most effective way. I would say, and Eric, you know this, but your colleagues, your former colleagues at the Department of State, the dedicated U.S. Foreign Service officers from state and from USAID that are working in this region are making an impact. I got to see it in 7 different municipalities, 50 different meetings in the 3 Northern Triangle countries in September. Everything from the Feed the Future program in the Western Highlands, helping with the milpa cycle to ensure there's adequate protein intake and the crops yield can be increased to help indigenous farmers in the rural areas, to this integrated effort in the Plan El Salvador Seguro, where communities are investing in law enforcement, arts and culture, vocational training and education in an integrated way. It takes committed local leaders and it takes American support and funding and kind of knitting together and helping integrate the efforts to make a difference. So from my perspective, I think it starts with identifying the real push factors and not trying to put a broad brush or blanket approach across the whole region. You have to have the insight and the nimbleness to apply different techniques in the Western Highlands of Guatemala than you do in San Pedro Sula in Honduras in a poverty community where there's gang violence. You got to be able to address both. Then again, I think there are things that apply broadly across the entire region. From our perspective, I think the progress on the customs union and on the desire for all 3 governments to build the professionalism and capability of their customs administration and then help enhance the cross-border movements in the region are very promising. And that's something that we're going to be great partners and continue to invest in. In Honduras, they've had a customs reform effort for several years called COPRISAL. They're about to move forward toward a new customs administration. They've got some great professional leadership, some tremendous ideas. We've got a 7-page list of partnership items we're going to work on to support them. The SOT, the Customs Administration of Tax in Guatemala, has a strategic plan that I think is very impressive that builds on all these areas. And we can help from a policy side, from an IT side, from a trade partnership side, and also just philosophies of risk management. We see significant delays at borders within Central America. 8 to 12 hours, 8 to 24 hours, for exports. Could be 3 days or more for imports. That dramatically impacts the cost per product, dramatically impacts their productivity. So if you see a textile industry in El Salvador that under the Central American Free Trade Agreement is making products that are very competitive in the U.S., we want that to be able to move smoothly across the border into Honduras to Puerto Cortez and onto a vessel so that it can get to the American market quickly. We want to help them develop that.
I think that's a critical point, and something we pointed to a lot is the competitiveness or non-competitiveness of Central America from an economic perspective, right? And, they're small economies to begin with. And if the borders are obstacles to trade and making countries less competitive, well, that's a good place to start in the context of trying to build economies that work better, create the jobs that people need. You know, there's a statistic, I don't know how accurate it is at this point, but if you put a product on a truck from Panama and take it to the US border, the amount of time it takes is longer, apparently, I've never tried this, but I'm told that it's longer than that same product from a ship from China to Port of Long Beach, and that matters in the business, you know, to business people. So I think the point you're making is very, very relevant and timely. Let me ask you, sticking on Central America for a minute,
and we've heard this from our private sector partners in the region, not just from the government and other partners. I mean, the private sector wants to move goods more efficiently.
Absolutely. You've used the word partnership a lot. One of the things we found in development activities, business activities, security activities, not just in Latin America, but around the world, is you really have to have local partners who are committed to the cause, who can work together, who frankly are not corrupt, who have a shared vision. You know, without going into any diplomatic details or anything like that, are you confident that the leadership in the Northern Triangle countries are the type of partners that we need to be able to have success on the program that you've just laid out?
So, yes, I saw a lot of tremendous leadership, a lot of people committed to their cities, their regions. I think of the entrepreneurs we met with in Quetzaltenango and their dynamism and their energy about the future for that region and building small businesses. I think about the mayor of Zacatecoluca in El Salvador and what he's been able to bring together across that community, from a law enforcement and vocational training, and really, I mean, he's got an orchestra. He has a youth orchestra that he's helped foster with U.S. support. I think of the leadership of Puerto Cortes and Honduras, which is modernizing and really creating efficiencies in the movement of containers throughout that region, which is a critical textile manufacturing in the Maquila region. So I see a lot of private sector, government partners that, and frankly, our security partners in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are all building their professionalism, their effectiveness, their ability to resolve crimes, their ability to protect borders, to prevent narcotics from flowing through, the security of their airports. There's a lot of really positive developments across all of these areas. So yeah, I think we have the partners to work with and to build from a foundation that's now growing.
Yeah. Job creation is a critical incentive for people to remain in their local communities. I mean, study after study shows that given a choice between staying and going, most people would prefer to stay in their local community, their local faith community, their family-based, their jobs, etc. But if there are no jobs, if there are no secure environments, etc., all the things you've been talking about, Mr. Commissioner. You know, and again, I understand your law enforcement mandate, but how does that relate to the job creation needs of Central America and frankly Mexican region and other parts of Latin America that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a one broad brush you can paint across all three countries. It's about jobs, it's about opportunity and creation, and we saw some very effective strategies, cooperatives, for instance, that are reaching out to small business owners and providing them a way to bring their products to market in the coffee industry, for instance. But really, it ties to that governance piece and the customs piece intrinsically. So while not as directly relevant, a CBP role, supporting U.S. government efforts and Mexican government efforts to partner with Central America on those issues, I think, are going to be good policy for us going forward. And I do really believe that customs professionalism, modernization, and integration is going to make an impact on the job creation in the region as well.
Mm-hmm. We're going to have a chance to go to those of you with your questions shortly, but as I mentioned, we're going to do this by index card, and if you could jot your question down, please, on the card that will be provided, and then we'll collect those and bring them up here for the Commissioner's consideration. And as we're doing that, let me continue the conversation with a slightly different lens. As I mentioned in the context of my setup conversation, these are very complicated issues, politically sensitive. They affect families and individuals on all sides of the border.
Right.
And you've laid that out very clearly and very effectively, if I can say. What would you wish Washington would take away from this conversation or from the whole discussion about Central America, migration, the issues that we're facing. Let me ask it a different way.
Okay.
And maybe it's an impossible question.
Sure.
You know, but it's something that I've grappled with a lot.
Right.
Because in order to make progress, sometimes you have to depoliticize issues and really address the root causes and the issues on the ground. How can we work together on these issues in a bipartisan way, depoliticize some of these issues, and really return the focus in some way to where it could do some real good by creating conditions on the ground to encourage people to stay in their home countries.
Right. So for me, I think it starts with grappling with the facts of what's really happening. We have a vulnerable population, again, that's being incentivized to come to the United States in a very dangerous manner in the hands of criminals. And we need to grapple with that. We need to deal with the aspects of our system that are making that attractive and making that an option, even if people won't eventually have immigration permission to stay in the U.S. I think that's first and foremost is statutory reform. We need to partner with Mexico. We need to attack the transnational criminal organizations that are preying on these individuals and that continue to profit dramatically from drug demand in the United States. There's no question that our law enforcement partnership, our partnership on migration policy regionally is going to be essential, and really that's a key priority to working with the incoming, or the now inaugurated President Lopez Obrador administration to address. And then I think we absolutely need to work on these push factors with focused and targeted aid, with accountability with our partners on the government side, and to keep reinvesting in what's working. I think we've got to hit all of those angles. At the border, we do still need investments in border security. I mean, I think that's still part of the dynamic. There's alongside families and children, we do have an increase in hard narcotics. We have a fentanyl challenge across our nation. We've got methamphetamine, which is even more of an issue in the western United States. They're at record levels. These are extremely dangerous drugs. The fentanyl overdose problem is absolutely epidemic, and they're coming through our ports of entry on our southern border. They're coming between ports in increasing numbers. We have to address that. We have to protect our communities. So you have to have a real conversation about what's happening and a dynamic, multifaceted strategy to address it, which I think has 4 elements.
It's a real balance, isn't it? Because trying to keep the bad things out, the fentanyl, the drugs, etc., as nonetheless encouraging the good things, the trade, and frankly, you know, the United States is a country of immigrants, and you know, it's been a basis of our own success globally forever. So we want to encourage people to continue to come to the United States in the right way, etc.
Right.
So the balance, I think, is just key. No, I mean, you know, and as the commissioner, you're grappling with these issues every day, trying to
every day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's $2 billion of trade across the southwest border every day. I mean, just. That's the lifeblood of not only the border state economies, but there are over 40 states that do $1 billion or more of business with Mexico. I think that's something we can't forget. In terms of the international piece, the largest part of our export economy is actually travel exports. It's facilitating lawful travel through our airports. We had a record level last year of over 130 million travelers. And we've reduced wait times 4 out of the last 5 years, even against that 5% growth each year through the use of advanced technology, some additional hiring. We're really working hard in trusted programs. Hopefully we got some global entry members here. You know, we're really working hard to achieve that balance, right? To understand who might present a risk and to really facilitate the vast majority of travel and trade, which is lawful and economically essential.